thank you for being here today. We'll go ahead and get started with any requests for bill introductions. Anybody have a bill introduction today? All right, seeing none. We're doing things just a little bit differently today because it was...
Any audio.
Oh, you're not hearing any audio online. Thank you for letting us know.
I'm hearing you clearly online, though, Mr. Chairman.
So am I.
Whoever chimed in.
All right, might just be somebody needs to take their mute off. Carrying on, as I mentioned, we're doing things just a little bit different today. I've had a number of stakeholders want to share some insights as it relates to the Juvenile Justice Reform Bill, SB 367, that was passed back in 2016. So I thought we'd have a bit of an informational hearing on that. After we finish with that, we'll go into a hearing on House Bill 2200. So I have asked Natalie to prepare a bit of an overview for those of us that weren't here prior to SB 367 to kind of share with us where we were and where we have come. So Natalie, turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back in 2016, the legislature passed Senate Bill 367, which was a pretty substantial reform of the juvenile justice statutes. Prior to that, in 2015, the governor put together a working group of stakeholders. There were prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, folks from the Department of Corrections, a multitude of stakeholders participated in a lot of discussions over the summer. There were legislators on that working group. They had technical assistance from the Pew Charitable Trust. And at the end of that work, they issued a report recommending several changes to our juvenile justice system as it existed in 2015. And that is how Senate Bill 367 came to be. So I am going to go over just kind of the highlights. It was a very large piece of legislation. There were a lot of technical changes, but I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of the things that were changed, the policy pieces that were changed in that legislation. And then if you guys have specific questions, you can feel free to ask me those. So the first kind of major change was that juveniles would be required to be delivered to their parents or guardians unless there's a reason to believe that it was not in the best interest of the child or would pose a risk to public safety or property. So it really reduced the reasons that juveniles could be confined to detention. Those juveniles would have to be given a detention risk assessment, and they would have to assess as detention eligible, or there would have to be other grounds to override that detention assessment in order for a juvenile to be taken into detention. In order to obtain a warrant to arrest a juvenile, a supervision officer would have to set forth that the juvenile violated a condition of disposition 3 or more times and that they pose a significant risk of physical harm to another or damage to property. So that ability to kind of detain those juveniles pre-adjudication or on what we consider, what we call probation with adults was greatly reduced. Each director of juvenile intake and assessment services was required to adopt a policy and establish guidelines for immediate intervention programs. That is what in the adult world we refer to as diversion. So this would be an agreement that the juvenile enters into in lieu of further criminal proceedings. And Senate Bill 367 required juveniles have the right to participate in an immediate intervention program for most offenses. So some of those most serious offenses, they weren't required to be offered immediate intervention, but for most offenses, they are required to be offered that. Cumulative detention of juveniles was limited to a maximum of 45 days over the juvenile's court case. Juveniles would be presumed to be juveniles. Before Senate Bill 367, there was no presumption that a juvenile should be treated as a juvenile under the Juvenile Offender Code as opposed to being waived to adult prosecution. And so that presumption was put in place, and that presumption would only be able to be rebutted by a preponderance of the evidence. The bill also required a juvenile to be 14 in order to be prosecuted as an adult, so they wouldn't be able to be waived to adult prosecution unless they're at least 14 years of age. Extended jurisdiction juvenile prosecution would only be able to be used for juveniles charged with an off-grid or a non-drug severity level 1 through 4 person felony. Extended jurisdiction juvenile prosecution is essentially a process where you have your juvenile sentence and an adult sentence kind of like running on alongside each other. So if the juvenile kind of makes multiple mistakes on their juvenile disposition, so say they are on probation as a juvenile and they make multiple mistakes, they can actually be waived and then treated as an adult later after that process has already taken place. The Department of Corrections, working with the Supreme Court, was required to adopt a statewide system of structured community-based graduated responses for technical violations of probation, violations of conditional release, and violations of disposition. They were also required to develop those standards for the immediate intervention programs that we talked about. Low and moderate risk offenders who were adjudicated for a misdemeanor and then low-risk offenders who were adjudicated for a felony would be able to be placed on probation for up to 6 months. High-risk offenders adjudicated for a misdemeanor and moderate-risk offenders adjudicated for a felony could be placed on probation for up to 9 months. And then high-risk offenders adjudicated for a felony would be able to be placed on probation for up to 12 months. And those probation length limits do not apply to juveniles adjudicated for an off-grid felony, rape, aggravated criminal sodomy, or murder in the second degree. The court can extend that term of probation if the juvenile needs time to complete an evidence-based program, but otherwise those probation length limits are in place. Overall case length limits were also imposed for cases involving juveniles. Juveniles adjudicated for a misdemeanor can remain under court jurisdiction for up to 12 months. Low and moderate risk offenders adjudicated for a felony could be under jurisdiction for 15 months. High-risk offenders adjudicated for a felony can be under jurisdiction for 18 months. And then those overall case length limits also don't apply to kids adjudicated for off-grid or non-drug severity level 1 through 4 felonies. Supervision levels were required to be based on a risk and needs assessment, and that has to be conducted before sentencing, or in the juvenile world, we call that disposition. Placement of juveniles in the custody of the Secretary of Corrections would only be able to happen when a juvenile poses a significant risk of harm to another or damage to property and is otherwise eligible based on the offense committed. Juveniles adjudicated for certain sex offenses can be placed in short-term alternative placements in an emergency shelter, therapeutic foster home, or community integration program. Before those changes were made, a lot more offenses were eligible for placement in the juvenile correctional facility, which would be a juvenile prison, JCF, here in Topeka. In fact, there was no requirement that the juvenile be adjudicated for a felony. So there were misdemeanants who were serving their disposition at JCF. Sentence maximums and certain scores needed for placement on the risk and needs assessment were created. So serious offender 1 category offenders can be placed for a minimum of 18 months and a maximum of 36 months. Serious offender 2 category offenders can be placed for a minimum of 9 months and a maximum of 18 months. Serious offender 3 offenders can be placed for a minimum of 6 months and a maximum of 12 months if they are assessed as high-risk offenders. Serious offenders 4s can be placed for a minimum of 6 months and a maximum of 12 months if they assess at high risk. Chronic offender 1s can be placed for a minimum term of 6 months and a maximum term of 12 months if they're assessed high risk. And then there's a rebuttable presumption that all offenders in the chronic offender category and offenders who are between the ages of 10 and 14 in the serious offender 2, 3, and 4 categories would be placed in the youth residential facility instead of going to the juvenile correctional facility. So that would be a lower security placement. Starting on January 1st of 2018, the Secretary of Corrections was limited on the number of youth residential facility beds that they would be able to contract for. So before there was no limit on that, and starting in 2018, they could contract for no more than 50 of those beds. A juvenile would not be ordered to be returned to the juvenile correctional facility for a violation of the condition of their release, and they would have to be discharged when their overall case length limit was reached. The Department of Corrections and the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee were tasked with exploring methods for exchanging confidential data between the different parts of the juvenile justice system. The Kansas Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee was created to oversee the implementation of the reforms. You got an overview from the chair of that committee last week. And then finally, the Kansas Juvenile Justice Improvement Fund was created, which now we call that the Evidence-Based Programs Account. Had a name change since 2016, but the Secretary of Corrections back then was required to certify the cost savings from the reduction in out-of-home placements of juveniles and then transfer that amount into that fund for the use of community-based programming for juveniles throughout the state. So the idea was that now that these juveniles aren't going to be in out-of-home placements, they're going to remain in their community, in their homes, but they're going to receive community-based programming. Prioritization of the money in that fund was to be given to regions demonstrating a high rate of out-of-home placements of juvenile offenders. And some changes to that fund are proposed in the bill that you're going to hear today, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. After 2016, in 2017, Senate Bill 42 was passed, which was kind of what we would refer to as kind of a trailer bill to Senate Bill 367. It made some minor adjustments. I have those outlined in my memo, but none of them are huge policy shifts necessarily. And then in 2018, you guys passed Senate Bill 179, which created juvenile crisis intervention centers. And so that expanded the use of some of those monies a little bit. To my knowledge, there are not currently any juvenile crisis intervention centers operating, but those funds would be able to be used for the creation of those. So that's kind of a very high-level general overview. And if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And thank you for your work on this. I know you were integral in helping draft this all those years ago, and it's really good to have your experience and your knowledge here. Questions, committee? I know there's a lot of information. Representative French.
Yeah, I just want to know, are you tired yet?
Not quite as tired as I was back in 2016, but yeah.
Only question I had, I missed, instead of diversion like we have in adult system, what's the juvenile word for it?
Yeah, we call that immediate intervention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely, thank you. Representative Keither.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Natalie, it was such a long bill. I don't know if it's easy to break down or if you can do it, but it passed in 2016, but many sections of the bill were put forward in different years. So are we all down the same road, and that's long enough now that we are going to be able to hear whether or not things are working well in every aspect or not?
So, Mr. Chairman, what I could say about the effective dates, there were a few things that were staggered. For example, the restriction on contracting for YRC beds, things of that nature. There were a few different years, a few different stages of implementation of the legislation, but 2019 was the last one. So now we're at a time where everything has been operating for a couple of years.
Great, thank you. Additional questions for Natalie? All right, seeing none. Thank you very much, Natalie. We will now hear from our conferees, our public comment on SB 367. The first conferee that we have is Judge Kevin Smith from Sedgwick County, who will be joining us via WebEx. Judge Smith, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, very well. Mr. Chairman and honorable representatives, I am Judge Kevin Smith of the 18th Judicial District. However, I am appearing in my individual capacity and not as a representative of the 18th Judicial District. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify about the need to amend Senate Bill 367 to preserve its underlying purpose while addressing its flaws. Governor Sam Brownback appointed me to the bench December of 2015, and I was sworn in January 2016. I served my first 4 years in juvenile court, where I presided over juvenile offender and child in need of care cases. I had the unique opportunity to adjudicate and sentence juveniles under the pre-Senate Bill 367 Juvenile Code, as well as under Senate Bill 367. Moreover, I now serve in the criminal department, and I'm seeing some of the fallout of Senate Bill 367. To be clear, the goals and objectives of Senate Bill 367 are absolutely essential. Children's minds are not fully formed, and their criminal behavior must be dealt with differently than adults. Moreover, incarceration doesn't necessarily diminish recidivism. However, Senate Bill 367's primary goal of reducing incarceration and increasing the use of community-based resources doesn't factor in a critical characteristic of many of these cases. These kids often lack a functional family structure to ensure that they complete treatment programs. In the 10 years before Senate Bill 367, Kansas experienced a 50% reduction in the juvenile crime rates, a notable achievement. One of the reasons I believe for this reduction is the ability of juvenile court judges at that time to retain jurisdiction over juveniles until the age of majority. These kids need structure and direction, especially when they engage in criminal behavior. In broken families where generational foster care and criminal behavior are endemic, maintaining the authority of the court over juveniles is essential to keep these kids on a productive path. Judges had the ability all the way to natural case termination due to juveniles becoming adults to give kids a choice between incarceration or completing treatment behavior modification programs. More often than not, they chose the latter. In broken homes or fractured families, these kids often lack the pressure from parents and extended family to finish these essential programs. Senate Bill 367 imposed maximum incarceration limits of 45 days and case lengths of 12, 15, or 18 months on all juveniles except for level 1 to 4 felonies or extended jurisdiction, and I flip those words back and forth, I apologize, extended juvenile jurisdiction prosecution cases. Almost all cases need more time than either of these limits allow to complete essential treatment and behavior modification programs. But when a juvenile has served his incarceration limit, that's that 45-day cap, or hits the case length limit, that's the 12, 15, or 18-month case length limit, the court loses jurisdiction over the juvenile regardless of whether he has completed terms and conditions of probation to include treatment behavior modification programs. I warned my colleagues when Senate Bill 367 was signed into law that when district attorneys reviewed cases for charging and discovered some of the challenges in cases such as these I'm discussing, they would take steps to give courts more time to modify juveniles' behavior. DAs would file more higher level felonies, level 1 to 4 person felonies specifically against juveniles, and file motions for adult prosecution, MAPs, far more often than before Senate Bill 367. I defer to Sedgwick County DA Mark Bennett for the actual numbers for both in our county, but it is accurate to say that both unintended consequences have happened. For MAPs, it's been almost exponential. Our DA filed almost 50 MAPs in 2021. The last number I had was 44, and that was sometime in November. And that's compared to the annual average before Senate Bill 367 of less than half a dozen per year for the entire county. When juveniles face more serious person felonies and even adult prosecution, it's impossible to claim that Senate Bill 367 has improved their case outcomes. These unintended consequences have erected far higher barriers to these juveniles' future success than before 367. As a criminal judge, I can attest that 2000, and I'm not bragging about this to be clear, but 2021 was a banner year for prosecution of juveniles for violent offenses in Sedgwick County. I have several pending cases involving former juveniles that were prosecuted under Senate Bill 367 and its deficiencies, as well as a couple juveniles that were mapped up for adult prosecution. I believe our other criminal department judges, we have a total of 10 in Sedgwick County, are facing the same increase. I contend that taking away juvenile judges' ability to at least impose the equivalent of adult case graduated sanctions for probation violations may be a cause of juveniles' escalated criminal behavior following disposition of their initial juvenile offender cases. To preserve the spirit of Senate Bill 367 while protecting the community, we need to eliminate case length limits and increase the maximum incarceration limit to the adult sentence equivalent, and give judges more discretion to impose incarceration sanctions for all probation violations. I also believe that for any probation violation, the judge should still be capped, similar to graduated sanctions in adult cases, such as 48 hours incarceration for a first violation, 72 hours for a second, 30 days for each subsequent violation, up to the incarceration limit. These tweaks will give judges the time they need to make sure juvenile offenders complete treatment behavior modification programs and even compel them to earn GEDs or high school diplomas, but will not allow judges to impose sanctions of such lengths as to cause more harm than good. Ignore those who brag about reducing juvenile incarceration as proof that Senate Bill 367 works. This just means that judges are following the law, which they must, and not carcerating juveniles even when they should be. Instead, consider what's happening with violent juvenile offenders. Sedgwick County Detention Facility's beds for juveniles being prosecuted for murder as adults have been maxed out for much of 2021. We also have more than a dozen pending juvenile offender murder cases in the adult courts, with other juveniles often the victims. This did not happen before Bill 367. It's happening now. While some will claim this is due to COVID, the fact is we saw these upward trends shortly after Senate Bill 367 went into full effect. It is not working. If we fail to tweak it to address these deficiencies, things will get much worse, not better. I end with a quote that applies to Senate Bill 367. Albert Einstein defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. This august body has been told about Senate Bill 367's weaknesses many times, yet has failed to implement amendments to preserve the good while extricating the bad. 2021's unique challenges, combined with Senate Bill 367's inherent flaws, have literally led to kids murdering kids, thanks in part to Senate Bill 367's kid gloves approach to juvenile justice. It's time to address these weaknesses so we can preserve the strengths and save children's lives in the process. I'll defer to my written testimony for additional information, as well as my nutshell proposals at the end of that written testimony. And I am available for questions if that's appropriate.
Certainly. Thank you, Judge Smith. Committee, do we have any questions for the judge? Representative Howerton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say thank you to Judge Smith. He's from my county, and I appreciate his testimony, his perspective. I do have a question, maybe for the revisor. What is case length? What does that mean? Like the 12 specifically? Sorry, it's a whole new world for me. So
Why we're learning.
I don't want to assume that I know what it is. I want to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So an overall case length limit is a total amount of time that a juvenile can remain under court jurisdiction. So, for example, if a juvenile is alleged to have committed, say, a battery, then prior to Senate Bill 367, that case could go on for however long it took to be resolved. So that kid could be have a disposition of probation, and then if the juvenile was violating probation, court jurisdiction would just be able to be extended. The judge would be able to extend that juvenile's probation until they felt that probation was no longer needed. So the overall case length limit puts a cap on that, and so at that hard deadline, the juvenile has to be released from the court's jurisdiction, unless, of course, they commit a new offense.
So regardless of whether everything's resolved, it's done at 12 months. Or...
It would have to be completed, yes, by that time.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, may I add something to that?
Sure.
Okay. One thing that I didn't mention, again, we're limited here, and I appreciate all your time. One thing I didn't mention is that case length limit begins to toll at adjudication, which is effectively when they enter their plea. but these assessments take anywhere from 30 to 60 days. So effectively, you're burning 30 to 60 days of that case length waiting for the assessment to the where it can be disposed of and where the juvenile can be, unless something's changed, where the juvenile can be sentenced. So for example, if it's got a 12-month case length limit, realistically, it's only going to be 10 to 11 months that the court will have to ensure that the child completes these behavior modification or treatment programs. So it's actually about 1 to 3 months shorter than what those case length limits indicate as far as time to complete programs. So I want to clarify that.
Thank you. Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you, Judge Smith. We appreciate you being here, and I appreciate, pardon me, your perspective. During your oral testimony, you made reference to mapping a juvenile or mapping up a juvenile. I'm not sure I know what map means in that context. Could you help me?
Well, yes. Thank you, Representative Carmichael. Mapping, it's an acronym. Obviously, we love acronyms. Motion for adult prosecution. Basically, if the evaluation of the child's behavior justifies it, even if it's a lower level felony, even if it's a misdemeanor, the prosecution can file a motion for adult prosecution, and then the case gets kicked to adult court, and then they're prosecuted as an adult.
Effectively, is that the same thing as waiving the juvenile?
Right. Well, what often happens is there'll be a motion for adult prosecution filed, and then there'll be a plea offer made, and that plea offer is contingent on the juvenile waiving that hearing and then automatically going to adult court. So that might be what you're referring to.
Thank you. I appreciate your help. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, seeing no other questions, Judge Smith, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, and thank the committee.
Certainly. Now we'll hear from Carl Oakman, the Chief of Police from the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. Chief Oakman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for this opportunity, and to the honorable representatives. My name is Chief Carl Oakman with the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. The Kansas City, Kansas Police Department is an advocate for the intent of Kansas Senate Bill 367. However, the intent has not fully materialized with reality in Kansas City, Kansas. Our city is dealing with constant violent crime that is often perpetrated by juveniles. This law that is supposed to address high-risk juveniles through an evidence-based intensive system makes it difficult to hold violent juveniles accountable. In addition, there's little to no options to hold juveniles, as we've seen a large uptick in the sale and use of opiates and marijuana accountable for treatment and their actions. The Kansas City, Kansas Police Department is actively developing and implementing data-driven crime reduction strategies. The following is some of our data and analysis regarding juvenile crime in Kansas City, Kansas. And so far in 2021, juveniles, 54 were arrested for firearm-related cases. Adults, 339 adults were arrested for the same cases. Juveniles made up 15.9% of persons arrested for firearm-related cases in 2021. The total number of persons arrested in 2021 by the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, juveniles made up 436 arrests. Adults made up 5,371 arrests. Of that, juveniles made up 88.1% of all arrests for all offenses in 2021. Out of the 436 juveniles arrested, 54 was firearm related, or 12.3% of total juvenile arrests. And one of the issues in KCK in the past decade, it's become quite common for juveniles to obtain firearms with little to no resistance. And it is unfortunately related to the change in some of the concealed carry laws that increase law-abiding citizens purchasing more firearms. The days of illegal gun dealers selling illegal guns out of the trunk of their cars are rarely seen. These firearms are often stolen from parked vehicles and burglaries of law-abiding citizens' homes, and a large majority of these crimes are committed by juveniles. These guns are often sold to other juveniles who use them in other violent crimes. And since the inception of Senate Bill 367, there have been far more crime scenes involving juveniles and firearms. It makes it difficult to keep these juveniles off the street. It is not uncommon to arrest a juvenile for a property crime, and then a few weeks later, the same juvenile is arrested for committing a violent crime. In Kansas City metropolitan area, Kansas City, Kansas police, as well as the Kansas City, Missouri police are constantly fighting to reduce juvenile gang violence. And we do this jointly. What we find is a juvenile will often be the suspect, lives in Kansas City, Kansas, the victims in Kansas City, Missouri, or the victims in Kansas City, Kansas, and the suspect lives in Kansas City, Missouri. So we work jointly to try to reduce the violence. Senate Bill 367 does not help. It makes the battle harder. These juveniles know that in Kansas, they may not be detained. The Kansas City, Kansas Police Department utilizes NIBIN, N-I-B-I-N, which is the National Integrated Ballistic Information System. And basically what that does is it tracks shell casings. The NIBIN data often links shell casings from shootings by juvenile gangs between KCK and KCMO. Juveniles with firearms and a lack of discretion and intervention by juvenile court to disrupt the violent cycle is a serious problem. And as I submitted in my written testimony, here's a few examples we had in 2021 in Kansas City, Kansas. Of our homicides, 6 involved juveniles. And this is in one age 15 was shot and killed by 2 juveniles regarding a romantic triangle. One juvenile age 15 was shot and killed by a fellow gang member. Suspect was a juvenile. Age 16, there was a large party in the 1400 block of Southwest Boulevard. And this was caught on video. One individual was shot and killed, age 16, gang-related. Another 18-year-old innocent victim was ran over and killed when cars was fleeing the area. There were approximately 10 different juveniles that fired weapons during this incident. Most of it was caught on video. Next, age 16, and some of you may be familiar, there was a case involving one of the Chiefs players whose vehicle was stolen, and the police department chased this individual around between Kansas City, Missouri and Kansas City, Kansas for approximately 2 days. And that was back in October. And in December, that individual who was 16 was shot and killed while purchasing a gun outside his home. And then age 17, 600 block of Roland, this juvenile was burglarizing a home when he was shot and killed by the homeowner. The Kansas City, Kansas Police Department agrees with the intent of Senate Bill 367, but well-funded evidence strategies such as conflict resolution, anger management, risk for retaliation strategies, etc., are needed. In addition, there must be early accountability for minor crimes to reduce the chances of developing violent criminals. The time requirement on detention holds of juveniles that commit violent crimes must be reviewed. If not, law enforcement and the community will continue to see a rise in violent juvenile offenders and juvenile gang violence involving firearms. That completes my testimony.
All right. Thank you, Chief, very much. Committee, we're going to go ahead and hear from the remainder of these conferees. So if you have any questions for anybody specific, let's hold that. Thank you, Chief. I just want to make sure everybody has a time to speak who came today. So we'll move on and we'll hear from Casey Dalkey, Executive Director, Child Advocacy Centers of Kansas. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Owens and members of the committee. So my name is Casey Dalkey. I am the Executive Director of Child Advocacy Centers of Kansas. I am very new to this role. This is my second week, and I'm pretty excited to have the opportunity to be here to speak for the first time today. So I have been in the child welfare world in one way or another for the past 12 years. Prior to my role here, I was a program director for the Child Advocacy Center out of Great Bend, Kansas. And so just real quickly, for those of you who maybe don't know or would like a refresher, the Child Advocacy Centers of Kansas is the chapter state organization that has oversight of the child advocacy centers in Kansas. So there's 16 fully accredited child advocacy centers in the state. We have one new member that's going through accreditation right now, so we'll hopefully soon have 17. And so what child advocacy centers do is we coordinate joint investigations for child abuse cases. We work very directly with our DCF, Department of Children and Families, law enforcement, medical staff, mental health providers, and what we call a multidisciplinary team. So our child advocacy centers really provide the hub for children who have disclosed abuse, come in to be treated, whether it is through a forensic interview, advocacy for the child and family, mental health treatment, and whatever is needed thereafter. And so what I would like to talk about today, and kind of give you guys a little bit of a snapshot of what we're seeing at our level with the CACs, is youth. So child sexual abuse is a big component of what we see at the Child Advocacy Center. So when we often think of child sexual abuse, we think of adult perpetrators on children. What we are starting to see more of over the last few years is juveniles perping on juveniles. And so that's something that many may not often think of. We're talking preschool age children to 17, sexualized behavior back and forth. And so that can be, damaging in many aspects. So along with the sexual abuse acting out with the juveniles, we don't have a whole lot of capabilities to treat that underlying issue. So it puts the child that's displaying these sexualized behaviors at risk, as well as other children that have exposure to this child. So when we're talking about siblings, other children at school, kiddos at daycare, can all be at risk when we have these issues going on. So, you might wonder what could cause this, what could cause a child to act out sexually or violently sexually to another child. A few different things, whether it's that specific child has had personal victimization, they have been witness to or exposed to some sort of victimization and are displaying learned behaviors. So what we see is treatment of that is imperative. And, catching those behaviors at whatever age it is, especially the younger age, is crucial to treatment and, rehabilitation so that these behaviors don't continue. So what we know is that evidence-based practice, there is a model that was new to Kansas, brought in 2018 by the Sedgwick County CAC. It's called PSB, Problematic Sexual Behavior, CBT, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And so this program comes from OU. It was brought in, Wichita CAC is seeing successes with that. Again, like I said, it's an evidence-based therapy agency. The problem is that Sedgwick County has it. That's wonderful. This is a need that's across the state. And there are multiple other CACs that really want to bring this service, this treatment service to their areas for the prevention piece. If we can catch these issues, like I said, and fix the problem moving forward, then the prevention there is crucial. There's a couple other CACs in the state that are working hard towards bringing this treatment program to their area. But it's expensive and it's limited. This is the only program OU offers that has the results that it does. And so, moving forward, we would really like to have access to, CACs would really like to have access to funding that could assist in bringing this program to more kiddos in Kansas that we serve. So I believe that that is all that I have. That was a real quick one. But I'd be happy to stand for questions. I know you said you were going to push those off, but I'd be happy to answer whatever I could for you guys.
All right. Thank you very much, Casey. Very much appreciate that. I served for 12 years on the board of Heart to Heart,
Yes.
so I have a big heart for our child advocacy center.
Yes, yes, thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll hear from Deputy Chief Jose Salcedo from the Wichita Police Department, who will be joining us via WebEx. Deputy Chief, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and honorable representatives, and allowing me the opportunity. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
An opportunity to add to my written testimony. Basically, we like to agree with Judge Smith, the earlier speaker. We are seeing this kids. The threshold of 3 violations for them to get their conditional disposition pulled or their probation pulled, it's causing them, and they figured it out, it's causing them to get out before the 45 days or at the 45 days and commit 2 or 3 shootings. We feel that the level 3 and above, like murder and rape and kidnapping, it just doesn't address it well. We think a judge needs to weigh in and determine if the teen is a danger to the community. It's not unheard of for us to stop a car currently. The kids bail, and our officers are finding an assault weapon in the car. Now, it's not against the law for them to have it per the current laws, but there's really nothing they can hunt in Wichita except for each other. So very frustrating. We do agree with the chief from Kansas City. We like the intent of the bill, but there needs to be more accountability for these young offenders, and it's really not that many, but they are the ones driving the gang feuds where people are getting shot. And I know in the written testimony, I highlighted 11 murder victims that were juveniles, 8 of which were shot with firearms. Before Senate Bill 367, we usually saw 1 or 2, so it's quite the difference, and it's the trend. And just to kind of add a little more hump to that is we are seeing that the drug markets are moving from brick and mortar into the virtual realm through social media apps like Facebook and Snapchat. And off the top of my head, I can tell you that these kids are showing up to do drug deals, usually for marijuana, but often our detectives are finding that these kids are setting up quite the smorgasbord of offerings on Snapchat. There are so many that we have to prioritize enforcement on the ones that are also violent. So that's something I think that'll change the drug landscape. And a lot of these markets are being driven by teenagers. So we think that the intent of the law is, in summary, the intent of the law is great, but to meet the 3 violations in order to get more time commitment is just unreasonable. And so we would advocate for the law to change to allow judges to be judges. And that's all I have, sir. Thank you for allowing me this opportunity.
Certainly. Thank you, Chief Salcedo. Committee, we've heard from a few folks. Do we have any additional questions for the 3 that spoke? Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question from Ms. Dalkey. Yeah. I may not have been listening carefully enough, but I'm not sure I heard anything about how the SB 367 has affected life in your part of the child.
Sure. So and that was specific as to why I wanted to give the public comment aspect, just to kind of talk about, how we see things that relate to our world and the juvenile offenders. I mean, when we're talking about children acting out sexually on other children, if they are of the age of charging 10 or older, oftentimes that does happen, and charging wise. And so, you know, again, with the prevention piece, that's what we were looking forward to. But I really just wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of what we were seeing and kind of make sure that it was an educational aspect. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and I was thinking from what you shared, it was also the funding piece created by 367 and the ability to access some of that as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Representative Smith.
If you'll stay up there, I have another one for you. So I was trying to catch it if you said it. I'm not sure I did. How are you doing staff-wise, caseload-wise, and facility-wise for CACs? I know in Coffee County, I'm the undersheriff there, and we have a bit of an issue. We lost some great investigators just a handful of years ago, and we're not sure why. But when that happened, we struggle sometimes to find the appropriate resources. So how is your agency doing now with all of that?
Are you talking specifically Child Advocacy Center staffing?
Yes, I'm sorry.
You know, that's okay. I feel that across the state we are doing well. I know that there are some agencies that are looking for the forensic interviewers. That is a very specific niche within the CAC that can sometimes be hard to fill. It takes a specific, you know, individual with the right type of training and honestly ability to sit in that room and hear horrendous things that have happened to children firsthand and be able to process that effectively. So, I mean, staffing wise, I think it's more the conversation of CACs across the state would love to have the opportunity to have more staff, you know, but we are very limited with our funding. I know that there are CACs, my previous agency is one of them, that was on hold for 2.5 years before we were able to get one new staff member that we had been asking for. So, you know, with us being grant funded and donations, it can be difficult staffing sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touch on something that's very, very important. That is, these folks that we lost is not somebody you can just go out and grab out of college to go out and start doing this job. It takes experience, and it takes people with the know-how to talk to these kids that have really been in some horrible situations. So that's a talent, it's a skill, and it's just sad that we lost them.
Yes, yep, I agree.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Representative Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate everyone who's been here to testify. My question, I think, is generally for either one of the chiefs, both of whom I know and both of whom I respect. Don't take this critically. But setting aside for just a moment the sexual-related cases, when it comes to other types of crimes of violence involving juveniles, I think we could all agree that we know that poverty, broken homes, certainly a previously broken foster care system, and the proliferation of firearms on the streets are also causative factors in the increase in juvenile crime, or at least juvenile crime that comes to our attention. And so why should I not conclude that those who think that we can fix the problems with juvenile crime by amending this law aren't really on a fool's errand? Because guns, broken families, poverty, those are the things I think that put children at risk for what we used to call delinquency. Would either of the law enforcement folks help me with that a little bit?
Mr. Carmichael, this is Deputy Chief Salcido. I don't think I'm going to disagree with you on the point that that a lot of the root cause to this is poverty. So I'm for significant investment if it would reduce violence. I don't think I would tell you no. There's a lot of factors that factor in, but you know, when a juvenile is identified as a chronic shooter, you know, the 45 days maximum detention, it's really not going to do anything. And if the resources were brought not just to him but to his family, and they were really intensive as the original bill called for, I'd be all for it. I don't think you're going to get me to disagree with you.
Yeah, and Chief, I'll tell you, I think when we talk about a chronic juvenile shooter, hopefully those are the folks that the prosecutors are, as Judge Smith instructed me, mapping, I guess, because if you're a chronic shooter, no matter how old you are, you really need to be in custody of Department of Corrections, in my humble opinion.
Mr. Carmichael, last I heard from DA Bennett is he has about 100 plus murder cases to try. So any more juvenile pressure when they're mapped into the district court would just kind of slow it down a little bit.
Well, not to belabor the point, but I would remind you, though, that if we maintain jurisdiction of the juvenile court, it's still district court judges. It's still caseload for the judiciary. But you and I are good friends. The deputy chief used to be my neighborhood police officer, so it's always good to see you, my friend.
Indeed. Likewise, Mr. Trump.
Thank you. Representative Heiberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like just to follow up with that with Chief Salcido. Chief, do you have specific examples of chronic shooters who are getting 45-day case limits?
Sir, I didn't put them in my written testimony, but I'd be happy to give you plenty of examples. Not just that, but I could give you case examples where we've caught. I mean, before SB, we used to maybe get firearm arrests in the dozen. Now we're getting significant numbers as well. But I could get those to you, sir, if you like.
Thank you, Chief. If you'll send those to the committee assistant like you did your testimony, we'll make sure that gets disseminated to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Thank you for all of your insight. At this point, I want to submit to you written only testimony from Christina Kersey, Senior Youth Defense Counsel at the Galt Center. We still have some time, and we have some people that came a ways. Let's go ahead and move on with the hearing of House Bill 20. Did I miss something? You're welcome to come up to the microphone and do so. Sorry, I didn't see you coming up, and so I wasn't sure you wanted to speak to it.
I just wanted to comment on Representative Carmichael's question, just from our standpoint. And I totally agree with the representative. There's several different issues, but you have to really, just like when you do drug treatment, we'll put someone in treatment, and then when they complete it, we put them right back in the same neighborhood where they started the addiction. So I think that's one of the issues with violent juvenile offenders, is that we put them right back in that same neighborhood that they where they were engaged in the violence. So I think one of the things in addition to that is when, as I mentioned in my written testimony, with conflict resolution, anger management, risk for retaliation. The problem with conflict resolution, we only give it to those kids who have had a conflict. I think it probably should be mandatory. Elementary school, have a session in middle school, and follow up with it in high school, because the other part is the juveniles now are having difficulty managing anger and not knowing how to deal with conflict.
And Mr. Chair, I appreciate the chief's remarks, and I'm really glad to see a progressive professional police chief in Kansas City, Kansas. I appreciate what you're doing, Chief.
Certainly. Thank you. All right. Now we'll go ahead and open up that hearing, after all, on House Bill 2200, and we'll ask Natalie to give us an overview of that bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2200 would allow the evidence-based programs account money to be used on more juveniles. It would require the Department of Corrections to build data systems and create a grant program for use of those monies in the evidence-based programs account. And it would also allow the juvenile overall case length limits to be extended for certain juvenile offenders in certain situations. Section 1 enacts a new section of law. It would require that the Secretary of Corrections and the Secretary for Children and Families enter into a memorandum of understanding to coordinate administering a risk and needs assessment to children who have been identified as exhibiting behavior that could lead to offender behavior during the course of a child in need of care proceeding. So those risk and need assessments that we talked about being administered on juvenile offenders, they would now be administered on children who have been identified as potentially starting to demonstrate some of that criminogenic behavior during the course of a child in need of care proceeding. That memorandum of understanding would include procedures for allowing those identified children to participate in evidence-based community programs that are offered by the Department of Corrections. A copy of that memorandum of understanding would be required to be provided to the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight, the Senate Standing Committee on Judiciary, and to this committee. Section 2 amends KSA 382203. That's the jurisdiction statute in the revised Kansas Code for Care of Children. Those are the SINC statutes we commonly refer to them as. This statute is amended to provide that if a child is eligible to receive services from the Department for Children and Families, the Department of Corrections, or the judicial branch, those agencies would be required to collaborate to provide those services. And nothing in this section would preclude a child from accessing services provided by the Department for Children and Families, the Department of Corrections, the judicial branch, or any other state agency that the child is otherwise eligible for. Section 3 amends KSA 382304. That's the jurisdiction statute in the Juvenile Offender Code. There's kind of a similar provision in there about providing services, collaborating to provide services to juveniles across all of those three agencies. That provision is stricken and it's replaced with one that's identical to the one that is proposing to be added to the SINC code, so that way there's just a continuity that all three of those branches are providing the same services to those juveniles. Section 4 amends KSA 382391. That's the statute that provides for those overall case length limits and probation length limits for juvenile offenders. That statute is amended to provide that the court can extend the overall case length limit to allow for completion of an evidence-based program when failure to complete that program is a delay due to the juvenile. So if the juvenile is not participating in the program, not going to the program, then that overall case length limit would be able to be extended to allow the juvenile to complete that program. Section 5 amends KSA 7552-162. That's the statute that requires the Department of Corrections and the Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee to explore methods of exchanging confidential data throughout all parts of the system. That statute is amended to require the Department of Corrections to develop a system to facilitate the exchanging of confidential data. The department would be required to report progress to the Joint Committee on Corrections and Juvenile Justice Oversight, the House Appropriations Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Senate Ways and Means Committee, and this committee on the progress of that development. Section 6 amends KSA 7552-164. That's the statute that creates the evidence-based programs account in the state general fund. Current law there allows expenditures from the fund for the development and implementation of evidence-based community programs and practices for juvenile offenders, juveniles experiencing mental health crisis, and their families. This bill would expand that to include children who have been administered that risk and needs assessment under the new Section 1 that were created and were identified as needing services pursuant to that section. And it would also allow the use of funds pursuant to grants, which we'll talk about in just a second. Those programs are currently administered by community corrections officers or offices, including juvenile intake and assessment, court services, community corrections, and juvenile crisis intervention centers. This bill would expand that list to include community mental health centers and any other community-based service provider, so it wouldn't just be limited to those specific service providers. Subsection E would require the Secretary of Corrections to develop and implement a grant program with the goal of implementing evidence-based community programs throughout the state. The Secretary would be required to adopt grant requirements, and then any provider of evidence-based community programs for juveniles across the state would be able to apply for a grant. That grant program would give priority to any county that demonstrates a low availability of evidence-based community programs for juveniles. The secretary would then be required to evaluate the programs that received grant funding to ensure that the programs are being delivered as that program was designed. Subsection F requires expenditures from that evidence-based program account to be made promptly and on a rolling basis to develop and implement evidence-based community programs as they're needed throughout the state. I would make one note, this bill was introduced in 2021, and so some of the dates in there, you might want to look at updating. For example, that memorandum of understanding we talked about in section 1 between DOC and DCF would be required under the statute right now to be developed before October 1st of 2021. That's obviously not possible. So some of those deadlines you might want to look at extending based on that. And I can take any questions.
Thank you very much for that, Natalie. Questions, committee? Representative French.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I haven't gone through all my emails yet, but is there a financial note on this yet?
There should be a fiscal note. I'm guessing that Colette sent that out in the first email that she sent.
Okay.
It is.
I'll go back and check. Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, thank you, Natalie. We'll go ahead and move into our proponent testimony and welcome Jim Howell, Sedgwick County Commissioner from Sedgwick County. Thanks for joining us, Jim.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Jim Howell, Sedgwick County Commissioner, and it's an honor to be before the committee today. I had the privilege of serving in the legislature for 2 terms back in 2011 through 2014. And back at the time, one of my focuses was on juvenile justice reform, specifically as it relates to criminogenic, medium to high risk youth, boys, residential homes. You all know Judge Juvenile Boys Ranch in Wichita, Kansas, Lake Afton. That was my focus at the time. There was a lot of work that happened at that time. I would like to just say that Representative Russ Jennings and I worked together. He was the chairman of this committee, I guess. I understand that. And he actually worked with me in 2013 and 2014, trying to find solutions to that Judge Juvenile Boys Ranch. Unfortunately, the county actually came out against the bill, and nevertheless, we did pass the bill out of the House, but unfortunately, that bill died in the Senate. So we were not able to actually pass legislation that would actually resolve that problem. And consequently, that boys' home has been bulldozed. It's gone. It's a campground now. If I understand correctly, across the state of Kansas, there really is no boys' homes like that anywhere, or girls' homes for that matter. So it's a loss of a resource that we used to have and used to enjoy. But one of the arguments we made back in the day was pay me now or pay me later. Taxpayer, I'm a conservative Republican. Everyone likes to be conservative in terms of their financial affairs. You can actually invest a little bit of money in a child when they can be changed, and it actually pays off in dividends later on because you can get them on a better path. I don't know who introduced this bill last year, but it's a very good bill. House Bill 2200 actually touches many of the right points that I think that are very needed, and so it's a very good bill. I support it in its form currently, so if you do nothing to the bill at all, other than change those dates, I hope you'll pass it out favorably. To quote Chief Oakman, that just a moment ago made 2 points. One of the points he just said was, they know they cannot be detained. That's part of the problem with 367. If you don't have consequences for behavior, you're not going to change the direction of a child. There needs to be consequences that make sense. And I think 367, from 80, again, anecdotally, 80, 90% of the kids, it's a fantastic bill. But Sedgwick County is 1/6 of the state's population, and we have a very urban part of our state. And we have inner city crime, we have gang crime, we have all kinds of things that are happening there. There may be 5 or 10% of our kids. 367 is not solving the problem. He also said something about it's not reasonable to take a child that finishes programming and return them to the very environment that caused them to get the way they did in the first place. That gets me back to several points. I'm going to make several points at the end of my testimony, but with that, residential options is one of those 5 points. I'll get to that in just a second. This is a very extensive bill. Senate Bill 367, we just talked about that. I hope you're convinced by now. Very compelling testimony. It's not good where we are today. We need to make some changes. Having said that, I do want to show appreciation to Russ Jennings and Greg Smith. They did a tremendous job writing this bill. It was a very complicated bill. I'm not an expert on 367. Just to understand how big this bill was, it was 72 pages long, had 38 sections. And then just the bill summary alone is 18 pages long. So it's a very complicated bill. I'm not going to be an expert on 367. I can just tell you, since it passed in 2016, as a county commissioner, I've seen the downward spiral of things happening in Sedgwick County. Again, for many kids, it's been great. For some kids, it's not been great. And that's where I want to say, I don't want to take anything away from 367. I want to add a couple of tools back in the toolbox. That's really the goal of today's testimony. House Bill 2200 is germane to all things in 367. We can use 2200 as a shell or as a tool to make some changes to the bill that was passed in 367. The entire bill actually is germane. So everything you've heard today so far on 367 or on this bill is something we can certainly get, we can certainly make 2200 all it needs to be to make 367 better. Russ Jennings didn't want to make changes to this bill for 5 years. That day is today. It's been 5 years since the bill was passed. And so I'd like to just recommend that we lean forward today to, rather than not doing something this year. This is the year for us to do something special. On our legislative platform, I have a few extra copies up here, Sedgwick County legislative platform. It does say on here, the Sedgwick County represents, this is our platform, Sedgwick County recommends changes or enhancements to Senate Bill 367. That's why it's on there. So part of my testimony today is reference to the entire county commission. The last part of my testimony will be for me personally. I understand that the state has actually quite a bit of savings. The Department of Corrections and DCF are operating independently. They're not coordinating the way they should. 2200, this bill actually creates a coordination between these two agencies. That needs to happen. I think DCF is not getting the funds they need, the grant funds to set up programming. Some of the kids right now we're dealing with in DCF used to be, they would have been under the DOC, but because of 367, we're dealing with them as basically children in need of care. As a consequence, there's, I guess there's at least 1 or 2 funds right now that are designated for programming that has been, these monies have been piled up. I understand. I don't know if this is true or not. Someone can please check me. But I understand there may be up to 40 or maybe even $45 million in savings since 367 passed that have not gone out to programming, have not gone out to communities that need those services. We know we have kids right now traveling as many as two counties away into Sedgwick County to receive services from Sedgwick County on the community-based programming. Let's see here. Right now, one of the problems we have today, we didn't used to have, is juvenile offender kids that would have been dealt with under the Department of Corrections, juvenile offenders. Because we're not charging them, because we're suspending their charges, we're working with them as with community-based programming. Those charges are never actually, there's never a conviction. So on paper, this child actually looks like a child in need of care. Some of these kids who are juvenile offenders end up in the foster care program. No offense to the foster care program, but I think we have some opportunities in our state on foster care. We've got to fix some things there. And right now, when you place a child who's very difficult, a juvenile offender, and you place them as a foster care child in our state, that may be a bad placement, and that foster family decides to close their door to this in the future, and we're losing foster beds, foster homes, because of placing juvenile offenders in those places. On my second page of testimony, I actually have put a box there, and if you're looking at the online copy, there it's green highlighted text. We had a meeting with 23 professionals in Sedgwick County, district court judges, DCF, St. Francis. We had district attorney staff there. We had county correction staff. All the right people were in the room. We had a very good meeting, I thought, 23 people at a round table, and they came up with 5 recommendations for changes of our state. Some of these are already taken care of on House Bill 2200, but let me read these 5. It's in that box. It says, remove or allow extension of juvenile case and probation length limits, which I believe is already addressed in this bill. Remove or increase juvenile detention limits. That might be an opportunity here. Allow juvenile judges the discretion to retain jurisdiction over an offender even following an adult conviction. In other words, allow the judges to have the discretion to retain jurisdiction. Then create an out-of-home placement option for high-risk juvenile offenders. I know that 367 talks about 50 beds. My question is, where are the 50 beds? I don't think they're out there. And again, there's money in the system right now to pay for residential options. We need to make sure we get that done. So create an out-of-home placement option for high-risk juvenile offenders. Provide and by the way, somewhere not in foster care and not in kiddie prison and not back in their home, not in their community. If we need another option, that needs to happen. Something like Judge Riddell Boys Ranch. Provide a possible immediate punishment or sanction for juveniles found in contempt of court. Right now, these kids are completely disregarding everything that's happening to them. You're throwing corrections solutions at these kids, and they're completely defiant. There's no sanctions that happen as a consequence. Now, I'm going to change my hats right now. I'm going to switch my testimony to me personally. Yes, County Commissioner Jim Howell, I'm testifying on this, not on behalf of my colleagues. This is me personally. We had a very high-profile case, Cedric Lofton here in Wichita, Kansas. You all know the case I'm talking about, the 17-year-old. 3 days from being an adult, he was in our juvenile system. He was picked up by WPD and brought in a RAP device. He was clearly in mental health crisis. He was brought in. He was told that he was going to be going to a mental health hospital. Essentially, that was not true. He was brought to the Sedgwick County JIAC facility. JIAC, by the way, is referred to 66 times in Senate Bill 367. There's a lot of information about JIAC. So again, we have germaneness dealing with the Juvenile Intake Assessment Center of Sedgwick County to this bill. He was brought in a RAP device. I'll just point out the Community Voice, which is a newspaper in the Wichita area. I think it's actually maybe statewide. It says here that, and I'm going to make 2 points here. In this article, it says, and this is in your testimony, it says a prone investigation conducted jointly by 2 television stations in Denver and Minneapolis found more than 119 deaths between 2010 and 2021, with a finding similar to the one listed as C.J. Lofton's autopsy. His cause of death was identified as complications of cardiopulmonary arrest sustained after physical struggle, restrained in the prone position.
Can I interrupt you real quick, Commissioner Howell? It is the intention of this committee, as well as possibly the judiciary, to have a hearing specifically dealing with the Cedric Lofton case. If you wouldn't mind, in the interest of time, possibly just wrapping up your thoughts as it relates to this bill, and then we would be happy to have you back at a time later.
I'll just summarize my points here. I think we need to have a law that prohibits extended use of the prone position entirely. Please do that. It is germane to this bill. Along with that, let me argue in the testimony, there's actually evidence from the Wichita Beacon using the RAP devices. It's been used 10 times on children in 15 months in the Wichita area. Never before the summer of 2020 were RAP devices used. In this case, it was used. It adds to the anxiety. It makes the crisis worse. It may be good for police officers. It's bad for the person that's in crisis. So with that, I'm asking for a prohibition of the RAP device. I'm asking for a prohibition for extended use of the prone position. When people have these situations going on, JIAC needs to give them mental health assessments and physical health assessments when they are in crisis. You can't put those things on the back burner and prioritize other things first. And that's the point. I think that this is a bill. If there's another hearing, that's fantastic. But there's a bill in front of us today that's germane to everything I just mentioned. So we can add those items to this bill. I could go on. I think I've said plenty, but I appreciate the chance to testify, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll go ahead and hold on to questions. I do want to give everybody the opportunity that's here to speak in person to do so. I would ask, just in the interest of time, that you cut where you can, but still get your point across. So we'll go ahead and call up Stuart Little, President of the Behavioral Health Association of Kansas. Stuart, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Stuart Little, I'm here on behalf of the Behavioral Health Association of Kansas. And I've come talk to you oftentimes about Community Corrections Association and their issues. And I just wanted to note my comments today are with regard to the supervision end of the components in 2200. The issues have been raised by law enforcement, and those are kind of at the front end of the system. I'm not going to address any of those. I will just kind of quickly note that the community corrections folks have reviewed this and didn't have anything that stuck out, so we saved you one other set of testimony. I'm going to only comment on 2 issues in this bill, and having watched this process from the beginning and trying to watch folks, and I struggle, maybe the only word, to figure out how to disperse these funds and where they ought to go, and some snagged and then comes back in. I feel like this structure from is helpful and constructive to have the memorandum of understanding, which creates a process, puts it into place, helps us identify and figure out who should have access to the resources and how they can be dispersed. Second part, and that's in the new section 1. New section 2, with regard to the uses of the funds, does 2 things, and you can see in my testimony for the Behavioral Health Association or substance use disorder treatment providers around the state. Rachel Marsh's testimony when she speaks from the Kansas Children's Alliance also talks about other folks. There are 2 things that happen in Section 6 that are valuable and important. Number 1 is that so 6A or 6A 1A adds the youth, the offenders, or their families as being able to access these dollars. So it allows a broader range of folks that where those resources could be used if you needed, for example, there were family issues that needed to be addressed and part of that behavior, as long as they were evidence-based practices, those could be utilized. At least that's my reading of it. The second one is in 6A2 that expands to a broader range of providers who can be accessing services. So if you need different types of specialized services, we've clarified who can get the dollars, how those processes can be distributed. And now there are even more folks who are going to be able, if they're providing community-based, evidence-based practices, to do those practices. And those are two things that from on the provider side, those are both positive additions to the bill. Be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Stuart. Next, we have Kyle Kessler, who just walked out of the room. We can always skip over him and come back as needed. Let's go ahead and do that for now. We'll go ahead and move to John Nicholas. John, welcome to the committee.
Thank you for allowing me to come, Chairman Owens and members up there too. As introduced, I'm John Nicholas, and I've lived in Kansas since 1968. I was studying to be a juvenile probation officer at Kansas State, and I ended up becoming a nursing home administrator, both ends. However, I have noticed the last few years there's been some things going on. We see lots of things in the paper and stuff with the juvenile stuff, how we're handling it and everything else. And I remember when 367 passed, there was a lot of positive stuff about it. And looking forward to today, I found something from the National Conference of State Legislatures summarizing it back in the day. 367 is projected to reduce the number of youth placed in out-of-home commitments, saving the state about $72 million for reinvestment in community-based programs. In the House Bill 2200, I found it refreshing to read Section 1, the Secretary of Corrections and the Secretary for Children and Family. I'm encouraged to find that a group of elected officials is actually doing something right now. I'm concerned about the length of time that the bill allows to get the memorandum in place. I'd like to see before the legislature leaves, but I understand realities. Our youth deserve better than what they've had through 2 administrations, 3 governors, and 3 sessions of the legislature. With the way the bill's been implemented, that needs to change. And I would also like to support Mr. Commissioner Howell's request on the reduction of restraints. I write in here that as an administrator, we went through 20 years ago reducing restraints to be restraint-free in adult care homes. We found that evidence-based improvements on the reduction of restraints. Senior citizens in adult care homes are different than juveniles in some ways, but in other ways, they're still people on both ends of the spectrum, and they still deserve the same amount of respect. I would also ask that when the restrictions on restraints is placed in law, that there are also requirements for education. The first couple of minutes that have been on TV about Mr. Lofton show a lack of awareness on the part of JIAC staff for their ability to intimidate an already scared kid through body language that needs to be addressed and trained. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We'll now have Kyle Kessler join us. Kyle is on behalf of the Association of Community Mental Health Centers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies for stepping out and doing double duty today. Again, I'm Kyle Kessler, the Executive Director at the Association of Community Mental Health Centers. We represent all 26 licensed CMHCs around the state that provided treatment and services to over 150,000 Kansans last year. And I'll keep our testimony short and sweet. We support the bill and would like to see it pass out of committee. And referring back to a previous speaker, if you passed it out the way that it is, we would be just fine with that. And it's something that for us, additional sharing of information between DOC and DCF is absolutely a good thing. If there was anything to potentially add, would be adding in KDADs in there. There are a lot of different agencies we work with now. I think prior to the State Department of Agriculture receiving dollars for farm and ranch suicide or farm and ranch mental health, we were working with 6 different state agencies before then, so at least 7 now. But even the identification and resourcing for evidence-based practices, certainly a very positive thing in a direction that community mental health centers are going, and the new certified community behavioral health clinic model is a big part of that as well. We support the bill and would stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. And thank you, committee, for your patience as we move through this. Go ahead and hold your questions. I really want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak that has shown up. We have written proponent testimony from Dr. Kate Coleman, a citizen, as well as Rachel March, Children's Alliance of Kansas. That's all we have for proponent testimony. We have neutral testimony from Hope Cooper, and certainly if she's here, we'd welcome her to the podium. Hope is Deputy Secretary of Community-Based Services with the Kansas Department of Corrections. Welcome, Hope.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm here today to testify as being neutral on the bill as proposed. And you can read my written testimony, and I'll just go through and highlight some specific things. So basically, section 1 through 3, that is consistent with current efforts that are going on right now between KDOC and DCF. We certainly can formalize that in the form of an MOU. Section 4, it expands probation terms. We would just ask for some additional language, which I put in there, which would actually have the court find and enter into the written record the criteria permitting the extension of probation. And then I would also suggest to figure out a type of cap on the duration and how many times the extension can occur. Section 5, the data exchange. So we do have an MOU between 3 entities, Department of Corrections, Department for Children and Families, and the Office of Judicial Administration. We have a data sharing MOU that has been signed. I believe we submitted that to you, so you should have a copy of that MOU. And I will just also update you and remind you that Department of Corrections we've already deployed the first phase of our new database system. So the second phase of that will address the correctional facility, but all of the community supervision piece, intake, all of that is already deployed. And I do know Office of Judicial Administration is currently deploying their new system as well. So that section is already in the works. And then in section 6, we just ask, because we do know that this fund is really the only funding stream to address some of these issues that have been brought up. We would just ask that for the assessment that we talk about criminogenic risk. There's a lot of risk assessments out there, and so unless it's very clear what we're trying to address, then it could be risk for whatever. So we would just add that word criminogenic risk be added into there. And then there's some discussion on the rolling basis for grants. So just some clarity on what that means so that everybody is really clear on what that means. If the intention is that all of the grants be able to be done at different points in time, that could have some unintended consequences. Currently, right now, just in that evidence-based fund, KDOC funds and monitors over 60, I have that here, over 66 grants just out of that fund alone. So if each one was on a different time frame, that does become very cumbersome and very confusing when we're reporting out outcomes. So just a consideration in that. It does also, as a rolling basis, it really then becomes a first come, first serve versus a competitive grant process. So just for consideration if you move in that direction. And that concludes my testimony on this, and I will stand for questions when it's appropriate.
Thank you very much, Hope. All right, now we'll go ahead and move into our opponent testimony. We have three folks to share thoughts with us. First, we'll hear from Mike Funkert, with the campaign director of Kansas Appleseed. Mike, welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Owens and members of the committee. My name is Mike Funkert, and I'm the campaign director with Kansas Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. We are a nonpartisan 501c3 organization that advocates for policies that build thriving, inclusive, and just communities in Kansas. First, I would like to just take a brief moment to address Senate Bill 367 and say to this committee, I always appreciate the input of folks on this issue. But as someone that has been monitoring these issues for 5 years now, as a person that has attended every single juvenile justice oversight committee in that 5-year span, I think I can call myself an expert on these issues. I asked this committee to demand the data when we talk about juvenile justice reform. We heard many claims today from a variety of sources, which honestly, I respect greatly their interest in making things better for young people. But I question the solutions that they've put forth. I question the lack of data that has been put forth. I respect Judge Smith's opinion, but for those of you that have not been around, I know that Judge Smith has been opposed to many changes involved in the juvenile justice system over the past 5 years. And if you all would like to speak to a judge that vehemently disagrees with many of the things that Judge Smith put forth today, I can arrange that for you. In fact, it would be with a judge with much more youth court experience than Judge Smith. The notion that Senate Bill 367 has led to murders, to increased gang violence, to increased possession of guns from young people ignores all of the factors that play into this. To say that because we aren't locking up kids more or keeping them on cases for longer, that they go out and murder people is absurd, and it is not borne out in the data. I ask you to demand that when we talk about this, people back up what they say to you with real facts. That's my request of this committee. On House Bill 2200, I come to you today opposed for two main reasons. First, this bill could have and would have, by definition, a net widening effect. And that certainly does appear to be the intended purpose of this legislation. And I recognize the need for services to be delivered to kids in both the youth justice and the child welfare system. But I want to caution this committee. First, programs don't always work across populations. What works for justice-involved youth does not necessarily work for children in need of care, and vice versa. And sometimes when children are put through programs that don't truly address their needs, we do more harm than good. But our more pressing concern with any net widening effect would be the lost focus on the intended population of Senate Bill 367. As I said, I've attended every Juvenile Justice Oversight Committee meeting for the last 5 years, and in that time there have been many big goals laid out for the expenditure of funds from the evidence-based programs account. Widening the net now and expending the resources on children that do not fall under the original intent of the bill will be selling our justice-involved children short. We firmly believe in the power of investments in prevention programming and support services for kids in the child welfare system, but the evidence-based programs account was created specifically for justice-involved youth, and we still have much work to do to create a truly just and supportive youth justice system in Kansas. And the work that is left to do, I think, was highlighted today as we talk about violence among children. A system, a goal for our system should be a system that helps kids at contacts, offers healing and support, provides skills and structures, and nurtures hope and the belief in growth and self-betterment. Over the past 5 years, as I said, many ideas have been laid out, and a lot of good has come from those discussions. But honestly, the biggest ideas remain unfinished or even unstarted. I'll highlight just a few very quickly. One, mental health resources. We've talked about juvenile crisis intervention centers for years. We've talked about mobile response units for kids in crisis. Cedric Lofton in Wichita highlights the need for these services. Two, substance abuse programming. Again, communities continue to ask for more resources to treat addiction and drug use amongst kids in their communities, yet we see limited progress. Three, the National Juvenile Defender Center, now the GALT Center, issued an assessment in 2020 that highlights the needs of our Kansas youth defense system and recommends many changes: better training, better pay, better access to resources, and continuing education for attorneys. All of those are important goals that could be funded out of the evidence-based programs account. And four, National Crittenden and the Kansas Department of Corrections are about to release a report that studies girls on the deepest end of our system and makes recommendations about how we could improve those outcomes and where we let those young ladies down. Those recommendations will cost money, and that is what those funds are for. Perhaps even larger than the previous concerns I addressed is our concern with the extension of case length limits. The 2015 task force, in a bipartisan effort, came together and made recommendations for the legislature to explore, many of which made it into Senate Bill 367. One key recommendation I want to highlight for you is policy recommendation 15 from the work group. It was to require a case length limit, a limit of the court's jurisdiction defined by risk level and offense type, and create a presumptive length for each level of supervision subject to the overall case length limit. The case shall be terminated once the case cap expires, and it may not be extended. This means that we, the adults, the system, need to get our act together and move quickly to intervene in a child's life, because the data shows that longer case lengths do not produce better outcomes. That was a key finding of that 2015 work group, and that's why we have the law we have now. So I want you to consider that, and that's why we are opposed today. And I want to extend to every member of this committee, my contact information should be on my testimony. If not, you'll see me around. Let's have a conversation about this, and let's talk about what the data truly says. Thank you for your time, and I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mike. And committee, I know we're running just a few minutes late. We do have two people on WebEx to still share with us. It's obvious I need to learn a little bit better about time management when it comes to setting these things up, but you know, we're all learning new things all the time, right? So let's go ahead and move on. We have Kristen Powell, Progeny Youth Leader on WebEx.
Hi everybody, my name is Kristen Powell and I'm a youth leader with Progeny. Progeny is a youth-adult partnership that's focusing on reimagining the juvenile justice system and reinvestment into community-based alternatives in Kansas. HB 2200 has proposed changes that are harmful to young people who come in contact with our juvenile justice system, allowing for judges to have more discretion in juvenile offender cases and allowing for case length limit extensions will set us back from the progress that we as a state have made when we passed Senate Bill 367. Since Senate Bill 367 passed, there have been calls to action by communities who are most impacted by the juvenile justice system to open up access to reinvestment funds because there is a clear lack of investment in these communities, and the youth who come from these communities are continuing to be overrepresented in our state's juvenile justice system. Both continuing to invest in state and institutionalized programs and allowing for judges to sentence youth to longer amounts of time in jail and prison will push us back and increase the amount of harm that is caused to young people. Our state is in a public health crisis with our young people because of the lack of programs and alternatives that we currently have, and we are allowing for detrimental consequences to continue to happen as we cycle these youth through one system to another. To paint a better picture of the crisis that the youth in the state of Kansas are in, I want to draw everyone's attention again to what is happening with the numbers for motion for adult prosecution or MAP hearings in Sedgwick County alone. In 2020, there were a total of 8 MAP hearings that were transferred to the adult court system. And by the end of 2021, there was a total of 43 cases that were filed by the DA's office for young people to be charged as adults. This is alarming, and our state should be asking questions when we have this dramatic of an increase of young people who are being sent over to the adult system. Senate Bill 367 was meant to be a bill that could be built upon in hopes that future reform efforts would continue and we could reduce the amount of harm that we are causing to youth and their families. Our state needs to move away from the harmful and punitive practices that are allowed to be used on our children. We cannot continue to use fear and punishment to drive our decisions on what happens to youth. We have judges who are frustrated because young people continue to cycle in and out of their courtrooms with what seems to be little to no consequences. But consequences do not always have to be the answer. Research has shown us that almost all youth engage in delinquent behavior at some point in their life. The only line in the sand is between who gets caught and who doesn't, and who lives in a community with police presence and who does not. Research has also showed us that most youth grow out of delinquency. But what about the few who don't? What about the few who are the high risk or violent offenders? Do we lock them up and then lock them up even longer when they don't learn their lesson? Is this really the only solution that we have? At age 13, I entered into the Kansas foster care system, and I spent most of my childhood from ages 13 to 18 in the Kansas juvenile detention facilities and secure care facilities. Every time I ran away, the system response was punishment and a sentence to time in jail. At age 17, I was charged with a level 1 person felony, and by 18, my charges were mapped into the adult court because the juvenile system had done everything that they could do to help me. Because of this seemingly horrific event in my life, I reached out to an advocate in the community who helped me fight this case and who, more importantly, mentored me, gave me employment, scholarships, community, and so much more. She invested in me through relationship and with opportunity, and from there, my life dramatically changed. I am now preparing to start law school in the fall of this year, and the rest is not yet written. A longer sentence in jail is not going to help a child. A jumpsuit, shackles, and corrections officers will not provide opportunity, healing, and rehabilitation for a young person. Corrections officers cannot continue to raise our children in Kansas. We have countless amounts of research and evidence that shows us that jail and prison is not the answer that will help our children. But what is the answer? Investment in our children, their families, and their communities. We have young people and organizers who are doing the work and who have done the work to lay out what we need in our communities. And I strongly encourage everyone to read Progeny's Blueprint Report as well as the Senate Bill 367 Anniversary Report. Both of these reports provide relevant research about the issues, and they are available on Progeny's website. And again, I want to stress that continuing to invest in state and institutionalized programs and allowing for judges to sentence youth to longer amounts of time in jail and prison will push us back from the progress of Senate Bill 367 and will increase the amount of harm and trauma that is being caused on our youth. And with that, I stand for any questions after the last speaker.
Thank you very much, Kristen. All right, we will hear from Jasmine Rogers. Jasmine is on WebEx as well. And she is with Progeny as a youth leader as well.
Yes. Hello, Chairman Owens and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everybody here today. I am here on behalf of Progeny Kansas. My shirt is down here. You just can't see it. But we had the opportunity to provide recommendations to you the last time I gave testimony, and I just wanted to thank you all for actually taking on all the recommendations that we provided on behalf of Progeny. But I'm here today as an opponent to SB 2200 because this bill as is going to cause further harm, and it actually set us back further than what 367 was intended to do. The amendments highlighted on page 6 of this bill, starting at line 20, stipulates that probation term limits do not apply to those offenders who are adjudicated for an offense which would be committed by an adult, would be an off-grid felony. So the way the code is already written, it already includes these stipulations for the high-risk offenders that judges are concerned about. And further on page 6, you can read about the code that already stipulates that if a young person absconds from their placement or if their probation officer cannot find them, that limit time only starts again once the young person has been found or brought to court again. So I feel like SB 2200 is not going to get at what judges are hoping to earn. And so another issue of concern for me is page 8, line 40, section E that starts at line 40 and ends on page 9, line 2, removes the requirement for the Secretary of Corrections to facilitate and implement new community placements in conjunction with the reduction in out-of-home placements. So since we have seen a reduction in out-of-home placements, we have not seen an effort to build new facilities. So we closed the Larned Prison, we closed the Boys Ranch, and all of them needed to be shut down. They caused immense harm to young people, and I know that because Progeny works with young people who experienced these facilities, who had to live there, or who were sent to several different placement options and received further and further trauma in the process of that. So there is a reason we shut down these facilities, and it was a good approach to do. But we need to do more investigation into what facilities replaced them. As we have seen what happened in Sedgwick County with JIAC, the facilities we have in community corrections and at the state level are still not up to standard and are still not a place where young people can grow. If we're supposed to be preventing young people from committing further harm, if we're supposed to be healing young people so they can become members of their society, you cannot have a trauma-informed environment that is replicated after an adult prison. And so I really hope that if SB 2200 is passed, that you all consider really taking out that amendment and still expecting the Secretary of Corrections to facilitate and implement new community placements in conjunction with the reductions that you have seen in out-of-home placements. Our blueprint report really highlights the steps that we can take to build new facilities and make sure that they don't cause further harm to young people. The intention of SB 367 was to transform the juvenile justice system, and going backwards is not going to help us in the long-term scheme of how we want to continue helping young people across the whole state of Kansas. SB 367 and the money involved in it gives us a chance to build out better programs for young people in order to help them treat their needs in the situations that lead them to commit crimes. And so when courts don't have opportunities to refer a young person to a new program, it's because that program does not exist. In Sedgwick County, whether it's Johnson County or even our small rural counties, the money is out there, but there's a disconnect between people knowing the services are out there and people being able to access the money to create these new evidence-based services, or even services that may not traditionally be evidence-based, but can still provide support to young people. And so I think in consideration of this bill, it's important to also remember that young people are still learning so much every day about the world, and that's including how to survive in it. Young people are always affected by the communities and the social context around them, and young people need a variety of preventative and supportive services, whether it's mental health care, anger management resources, just restorative approaches in general that are not punitive, and resources that empower young people to improve their lives, even in difficult circumstances. That is how you prevent young people from committing further harm. We need options that heal and support our young people. Courts need more options that heal young people and actually get at the root causes. The Kansas City police officer that even mentioned, we can keep this young person here and give them their tools, but they go back into a community that is not being invested in as much as that one program was able to invest in the young person. And so I would really just encourage all of you to take a closer look at this bill before you vote on it and really consider making the changes that I suggested. But I also encourage you all to read Progeny's blueprint report that really highlights the steps that we can take to build new facilities and incorporate young people into these processes in a meaningful way. It was said that 23 members of the Sedgwick County Committee, or the Sedgwick County community, were spoken to in relation to this bill, but nobody spoke to young people who will directly be affected by this. Nobody has spoken with young people who have experienced JIAC, who have experienced the Boys Ranch, who are still in foster care placements. And that is the perspective that will help you make better policies for the future that you may not need to come back and make amendments to. So really that is all I had for you all today, and I encourage new members of this committee to read our SB 367 report. It was done in partnership with Kansas Appleseed and a bunch of other really knowledgeable organizations that did interviews with members of this committee who helped pass 367, members who were part of the research team for SB 367, and it really walks you through why we needed it, what has changed in the past 5 years, and some recommendations that can help guide the work that you all are doing here today. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. And again, committee, thank you very much for your patience. It's obvious that there's a lot involved in the conversations that we're having, and certainly we can talk as a committee about whether we want to have additional hearings on this topic as well, because there's a lot to be said. I do, however, since we have gone this far, want to give anybody an opportunity to ask any last-minute questions that they may have for anyone. Representative Heiberger.
Shall I have a revised request?
Certainly.
Could you provide us with data for the last 5 years on violent crimes by adults compared to juveniles? Is that clear?
Mr. Chairman, I think Representative Heiberger was making a research.
I meant research, yes.
Yep.
Hopefully. Is that something you'd be able to help with? All right. Thank you. We'll do that. Representative Osman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Powell, Ms. Rogers, my question is generally for you, specifically for Ms. Powell. I'm looking at your testimony, and thank you very much for your testimony. I see in here, so one of the things that you mentioned is about MAPS and the increase in MAPS over the last couple of years, which seems to correspond with some of the earlier testimony that we heard, both about 367 in general and in proponent testimony for HB 2200. And the other aspect of it is you say that you wish that, I apologize in here, it's SB 367 was meant to be a bill that could be built upon in hopes of future reforms. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but let me ask, would it be fair to say that your testimony is 367 needs to be reformed, just that SB 2200 HB 2200 as it stands right now may not be the appropriate path?
Yes, I would say that's correct, because I don't think that punitive responses are going to help with the amount of numbers for MAP trials or youth that are being charged as an adult. And I think that will continue to cause more harm. So I did reference that, but in a different way, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would just say I echo everything that Kristen had said, because there's also significant data that shows waiving a young person to adult court can also cause further harm to that young person. It actually increases their recidivism likelihood.
Right. Thank you, guys. And again, thank you very much, committee. I think we've heard from everybody and got our questions answered. I appreciate everybody's patience. We'll go ahead and close the hearing for House Bill 2200 now, and we will adjourn the meeting as well. Thank you.